I was already inside the house when I realized the chair was not facing the wall, but facing me from the inside of the wall. I stood frozen in the hallway with my bag still cutting into my shoulder as the fabric covering the furniture moved slightly even though the windows were sealed. The chair sat uncovered in the corner of the living room with its legs planted firmly as if nailed through the floor. The wall in front of it showed marks that looked old and deliberate, like something had leaned there for years without shifting. I stepped closer and saw the paint scratched at eye level in narrow, horizontal lines. The smell of stale cloth and dust mixed with something metallic lingered in the air. I reached out and touched the back of the chair and felt warmth that did not belong in an empty house. I pulled my hand away and heard a sound come from the wall itself, as if pressure had been released. I backed away, and my heel struck something soft under the covered sofa. I bent down and lifted the cloth enough to see deep grooves carved into the floorboards. I did not scream, because my voice had already left me earlier without permission. I stood there listening to the house settle in a way that sounded practiced. I turned toward the hallway mirror and saw the outline of my movement arrive a moment too late. I moved again, and the delay repeated with accuracy. I reached the front door and found the lock turned from the inside. I checked the windows, and every latch was fastened. I returned to the chair and noticed the seat cushion was indented, as if someone had just stood up. I followed the line of sight from the chair straight into the wall. I pressed my ear to the surface and heard breathing that stopped when I did. I stepped back and the sound resumed. I ran my fingers along the wall and felt uneven plaster hiding something hollow. I remembered then that I had not always lived alone here. I remembered leaving without saying goodbye. I remembered locking the door behind me years ago, believing distance could erase rooms. I remembered the chair being moved before I left and not asking why. I remembered the rule about never sitting there. I remembered breaking it once. I remembered the wall feeling warm then too. I remembered a voice speaking from the other side, using my name without urgency. I remembered promising not to return. I remembered standing there, now knowing I had already failed. Years earlier, I had come to this house after inheriting it from a woman no one visited. I found the furniture arranged, as if paused mid-conversation. I noticed the chair in the corner, even then turned toward the wall. I asked neighbors about it, and they shrugged without meeting my eyes. I slept in the back room and heard movement near the living room at night. I placed a glass against the wall and listened to muffled sounds that matched my breathing pattern. I tried covering the chair and found the cloth pulled away each morning. I tried turning it around and found it returned by nightfall. I marked the floor to test it, and the marks shifted without dragging. I pressed my palm to the wall and felt a pulse that matched my own timing. I brought a carpenter to inspect it, and he refused to touch that section. I placed a camera in the corner, and the footage showed the chair moving without crossing space. I watched the wall surface ripple slightly during playback. I stopped watching after hearing my voice spoken from inside the recording. While I was asleep elsewhere, I confronted the wall and spoke aloud. And the response came immediately, repeating my words with improved clarity. I tested it with phrases I had never said before, and the wall learned them quickly. I realized then that the chair was positioned for listening. I moved out weeks later and locked the door. I told myself the house would empty itself without me. I told myself walls forget. I built a life elsewhere and avoided thinking about corners. I avoided sitting with my back exposed. I avoided rooms with single chairs. I avoided returning calls about the property. I returned now because the letters stopped and silence followed. I returned because something in me wanted confirmation. I returned because the house had not finished. I stood again before the chair and understood it had been waiting. I understood the wall had been fed years of observation. I understood the house had practiced my movements. I understood why the lock turned inward. I understood why the mirror lagged. I understood the rule was never about sitting. I understood it was about facing. I dragged the chair away from the wall, and the sound behind it intensified. The plaster cracked in a straight line at seated eye level. I pulled harder, and the legs resisted, as if embedded deeper than wood should go. I heard fingers press from the other side, leaving brief impressions. I backed away, and the impressions followed my height. I grabbed a lamp and smashed the wall where the chair had faced. The plaster gave way to reveal a narrow cavity shaped by use. Inside was a smooth surface, worn by years of proximity. I leaned closer and saw dents that matched facial structure. I saw marks where breath had condensed repeatedly. I saw stains that traced speech patterns. I understood then the wall had been a listener trained by one subject. I heard my voice again from inside, repeating a memory I had never shared aloud. I stepped back, and the cavity widened on its own. I saw movement within, not crossing outward, but adjusting position. I realized the chair was not for someone in the room. I realized it was for someone learning to be in the room. I realized the wall had practiced watching me from inches away. I realized the delay in the mirror was rehearsal. I realized the warmth came from proximity. I realized the house was not empty when I left. I realized it had been studying absence. I realized it needed my return to complete alignment. I moved toward the door and felt the floor dip as weight shifted behind the wall. I ran, and the hallway shortened without changing length. I reached the door and felt breath at my ear, matching my pace. I stopped, and it stopped. I turned, and it turned. I stood still, and the house adjusted. I understood movement was the lesson. I understood stillness was the goal. I returned to the living room and placed the chair back where it belonged. I sat down because standing was no longer an option. I faced the wall and felt the cavity align perfectly with me. I felt the space adjust its depth to my posture. I spoke and heard nothing back because it no longer needed to repeat. I stayed seated as the house matched my breathing. I stayed seated as the warmth increased. I stayed seated as the mirror delay vanished. I stayed seated as the door unlocked itself behind me. I stayed seated as the wall pressed closer without touching. I stayed seated as memories surfaced without images. I stayed seated as the house practiced being me. I stayed seated as time lost shape. I stayed seated as the chair settled permanently. I stayed seated as the wall finished learning. I stayed seated as the house became accurate. I stayed seated until movement happened elsewhere using my timing. I stayed seated until footsteps crossed rooms I was not in. I stayed seated until the lock turned outward. I stayed seated until the mirror reflected on time without me moving. I stayed seated until the house no longer required me present. I stayed seated until the role was complete. I stayed seated until the warmth left the chair. I stayed seated until silence returned properly. I stayed seated because leaving was no longer the rule. I stayed seated because the house had finally learned how to stand.